A skeleton this old and this complete should have been scattered or destroyed thousands of years ago. Nobody was searching for one when it turned up. 3 recreational cave divers, mapping tunnels for their own private project, swam a mile through total darkness and dropped into a chamber none of them expected. What they found, resting on the floor, turned out to be Naya, and her bones changed how scientists understood the first Americans, the divers who found the wrong kind of cave. In 2007, 3 cave divers, Alejandro Alvarez, Alberto Nava, and Franco Attolini, were mapping the underwater cave systems beneath Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula as part of a group called the Proyecto Espeleológico de Tulum, an organization dedicated to exploring and surveying the region's flooded caves. By that point, the group had already charted more than 220 kilometers of underwater passages across Quintana Roo, treating the work as a long-term, systematic mapping project rather than any kind of archaeological hunt. The 3 men swam roughly a mile through a flooded tunnel that day, part of a system called Sac Acton, before the floor beneath them simply disappeared. Nava later described the moment plainly, saying the floor fell away and they could not see across to the other side no matter which direction they pointed their lights. Their beams barely reached into the darkness ahead of them, swallowed up by a chamber far larger than anything they had expected to find at the end of an ordinary passage. They named the pit Hoyo Negro, Spanish for black hole, a fitting description for a space their lights genuinely struggled to fill. None of the 3 divers were archaeologists, and none of them had set out that day expecting to find anything beyond another stretch of cave to add to their growing survey map. What they were about to discover on the chamber floor would end up rewriting a chapter of American prehistory that professional scientists had been arguing about for decades. The pit that swallowed a mile of darkness. Hoyo Negro sits deep inside the Sac Acton cave system, one of the largest underwater cave networks on Earth, stretching beneath the jungle north of the city of Tulum. The pit itself is a massive, dome-shaped, bell-like void, roughly the size of a professional basketball arena, dropping more than 100 feet, close to 30 meters, straight down inside the flooded rock. Naya's remains specifically came to rest at a depth of about 42 meters below the water's current surface, a genuinely serious depth for any diver, let alone one carrying scientific equipment and trying to work carefully without disturbing anything. Reaching the bottom requires a genuinely demanding technical dive, even for experienced cave divers. Researchers accessing the site have to first climb down a 30-foot ladder inside a nearby sinkhole, then swim roughly 200 feet through a narrow connecting tunnel to reach the rim of the pit itself, before finally making a final 100-foot drop straight down into the dark chamber below. Only divers with specialized technical cave training can safely attempt that entire sequence, which is exactly why the site sat completely undisturbed for so long before anyone with the right skills happened to swim through it. Today, Hoyo Negro sits roughly 130 to 150 feet below sea level, but that was never how the pit originally existed. Understanding how a chamber this deep ended up completely submerged, and exactly what was sitting scattered across its floor once the divers' lights finally settled, meant piecing together a story that stretched back to the final years of the last ice age. What was waiting on the floor? Once the divers' eyes adjusted and their lights swept across the chamber floor, they realized the pit was littered with bones, an entire graveyard of extinct Ice Age animals scattered across the bottom of the pit. Researchers who later studied the site identified remains from saber-toothed cats, specifically the species Smilodon fatalis, along with giant ground sloths, cave bears, giant tapirs, and an elephant-like creature called a gomphothere, a smaller, ancient relative of modern elephants that once roamed the Yucatan alongside mammoths elsewhere in Mexico. Smaller animals turned up scattered among the larger remains too, including bones from pumas, bobcats, coyotes, coatis, boars, and bats, giving researchers an unusually complete cross-section of exactly which animals were living across this stretch of the Yucatan during the final centuries of the last ice age. Joaquin Arroyo Cabrales, a senior scientist with Mexico's National Institute of Anthropology and History, and an expert in exactly this kind of ancient elephant relative, has described the Hoyo Negro gomphothere species, Cuvieronius hyodon, as considerably smaller than the massive Columbian mammoths found at other Mexican fossil sites, comparing its size more closely to a modern Asian elephant. Researchers eventually identified fossils from at least 26 separate animals scattered across the pit floor, along with a previously unknown member of the giant ground sloth family never documented anywhere else before. The pattern explaining why so many different animals ended up trapped in the same pit turned out to be fairly simple once researchers understood the site's original layout. At the time these animals died, the cave system sat mostly dry, and Hoyo Negro functioned as a genuine death trap, a hidden pit sitting at the end of a pitch-black passage that thirsty animals wandering the tunnel in search of water would have had no way to see coming before it was already too late. Sitting among all those animal bones, resting on a small ledge partway up the pile, the divers found something that did not belong there at all. The skull, lying upside down. Amid the scattered animal remains, the divers spotted a human skull lying upside down on a small ledge, surrounded by additional bones belonging to the same skeleton. The remains turned out to be remarkably complete for something so ancient, a rare and genuinely valuable condition for any skeleton this old, since scavengers, shifting sediment, and general decay usually scatter or destroy most ancient remains long before anyone ever finds them. The divers gave the skeleton a name, choosing Naya, drawn from the Naiads, water nymphs from ancient Greek mythology tied to springs, rivers, and other freshwater sources, a fitting name for a girl whose bones had spent thousands of years resting inside a flooded cave. Cave diving scientist Patricia Beddoes of Northwestern University, one of the two specialized cave diving researchers who personally worked at the bottom of Hoyo Negro during later research expeditions, later described the preservation as amazing, noting the bones sat beautifully exposed directly on the rock floor of the cave, protected by the specific quiet, still conditions of the water, and the complete absence of any covering soil layer. That level of preservation mattered enormously for everything scientists would eventually be able to learn from her remains, but confirming the skeleton's authenticity, age, and significance required bringing in outside expertise far beyond what 3 recreational cave divers could provide on their own. The scientist who eventually took charge of that investigation had already lived through one of the most contentious skeletal discoveries in modern American archaeology, and that earlier experience shaped almost everything about how this new case would unfold. The scientist who had already been through this before, forensic anthropologist James Chatters, working through his consulting firm Applied Paleoscience in Bothell, Washington, became the principal investigator studying Naya's remains, eventually serving as lead author on the major scientific paper describing the discovery. Chatters was already a familiar name in American archaeology for a very different reason. Nearly 2 decades earlier, he had been the first scientist to examine a skeleton dating back 9,500 years, discovered in Washington state and known as Kennewick Man, a case that erupted into a bruising, years-long legal and cultural battle over race, cultural identity, and who had the right to determine what should happen to ancient human remains. Chatters had argued at the time that Kennewick Man's skull did not closely resemble the skulls of modern Native Americans, a claim that angered Northwest tribes who considered the remains those of a direct ancestor and fought for years for the right to rebury what they called the Ancient One. That earlier controversy had pushed Chatters out of the spotlight for a period, keeping a comparatively low profile in the years that followed as the Kennewick Man legal battle continued working its way through the courts. Naya's discovery brought Chatters back into the same difficult territory, a skeleton whose physical features once again did not obviously match modern Native American appearance, and this time, the case would carry the added weight of usable, testable DNA that Kennewick Man's more degraded remains had never fully allowed. Before any of those genetic questions could even be asked, though, Researchers first needed to understand exactly how this teenage girl had ended up at the bottom of a pit in the first place. How she actually died. Chatters and his colleagues pieced together a fairly clear picture of Naya's final moments using the physical evidence available at the site. At the time she died, roughly 12,000 to 13,000 years ago, Hoyo Negro's chamber sat well above the water table, part of a mostly dry cave system rather than the flooded space divers would eventually swim through millennia later. Researchers believe Naya, likely a teenager exploring or searching for water deep inside the cave system, fell through an opening at the surface and plunged more than 100 feet down into the pit below. Examination of her remains showed a broken pelvis, an injury consistent with a serious fall from that kind of height. Chatters has stated plainly that he believes she died almost instantly, if not immediately upon impact, sparing her a prolonged death trapped alone at the bottom of a completely dark pit with no way to climb back out. That same fate, falling into an invisible pit while wandering a pitch-black tunnel, appears to explain nearly every one of the extinct animal remains found scattered around her, animals that had almost certainly followed the same tunnel searching for water long before or after Naya made the same fatal mistake herself. Her body then sat undisturbed on that ledge for thousands of years, while the world above her changed dramatically as melting glaciers at the end of the Ice Age slowly raised sea levels across the entire region, eventually flooding the cave system completely and sealing her remains behind a wall of water nobody would be able to safely cross for millennia. Confirming exactly how long that process had taken and exactly how old her remains truly were required scientists to run several independent, carefully cross-checked dating methods rather than relying on any single test alone. Proving how old she really was. Determining Naya's precise age required combining several separate scientific dating methods, since no single technique alone could fully settle the question with the confidence researchers needed. Scientists radiocarbon dated a molar taken directly from her remains, measuring the natural decay of radioactive carbon trapped inside the tooth enamel since the moment she died. Separately, researchers used a technique called uranium-thorium dating on small calcite crystal growths that had formed directly on her bones over time, since these mineral deposits build up at measurable, predictable rates once submerged in water. Researchers also studied regional sea level data covering the entire Yucatan coastline, since knowing exactly when rising after Ice Age seas would have flooded Hoyo Negro itself provided a critical secondary check on the other dating methods. That sea level analysis showed the specific chamber housing Naya's remains would have become fully submerged sometime between about 9,700 and 10,200 years ago, confirming her death had to have happened considerably earlier than that flooding event for her remains to already be resting on the chamber floor beforehand. Combining all of these independent lines of evidence, researchers concluded Naya died somewhere between roughly 12,000 and 13,000 years ago, making her remains among the 3 oldest human skeletons ever confirmed anywhere in the Americas. That settled timeline placed her squarely within the late Pleistocene epoch, the final stretch of the last Ice Age, and firmly established her as a genuine Paleo-American, one of the earliest known people to have lived anywhere on the entire continent. That same timeline also set up one of the strangest and most scientifically significant puzzles buried inside her own skeleton. The face that didn't match the DNA. Naya's skull carried a very specific, recognizable set of physical features that researchers have come to call classic Paleo-American craniofacial traits, including a long, narrow skull shape, a small and short face, wide-set eyes, a low and notably prominent forehead, a flat nasal opening, and teeth that projected noticeably outward. Chatters described her overall look bluntly in interviews following the discovery, stating her features were about the opposite of what Native Americans look like today, A striking, deliberately blunt comparison meant to highlight exactly how visually different her skull appeared compared to typical modern Native American skull shapes. That specific mismatch had already generated real scientific controversy for years before Naya's discovery, since researchers had previously found similar unusual skull shapes on other ancient American remains and had struggled to explain the apparent gap between these older, physically distinct Paleo-American skulls and the skull shapes typically seen among modern Native American populations. Some researchers had floated theories involving separate, unrelated waves of migration into the Americas to explain that visual gap, theories that carried real cultural and political weight given their potential implications for Native American ancestry claims. Before we move further into this, if you're finding this interesting, take a second to subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. Naya's case offered something no earlier discovery had ever managed to provide, a skeleton old enough, and remarkably well preserved enough, to actually test that theory directly, using real genetic material rather than skull shape comparisons alone. Solving that exact puzzle meant extracting workable ancient DNA from her remains, a genuinely difficult technical challenge given how many thousands of years her bones had already spent submerged in water. What her DNA actually proved. Researchers successfully extracted mitochondrial DNA directly from one of Naya's molars, a genuinely remarkable technical achievement given how degraded genetic material typically becomes after being submerged in water for over 10,000 years. Beddoes credited the cave's unusually calm, undisturbed conditions directly for this success, explaining that Naya's skeleton ended up in exactly the right kind of quiet, sediment-free water, without any covering soil, allowing her team to recover enough intact genetic material to actually run a full comparison against modern populations. The results, published in the journal Science on May 16, 2014, showed Naya's mitochondrial DNA carried genetic markers found specifically among modern Native American populations today, providing the first direct genetic link ever established between a Paleo-American skeleton bearing these unusual older skull features and living Native American communities. That finding meant the two groups, despite looking strikingly different from each other physically, actually shared common genetic roots tracing back to the same original source population. Broader analysis placed that shared ancestry specifically in Beringia, the ancient land bridge region connecting what is now northwest Alaska and the Russian Far East, supporting the long-standing theory that the earliest Americans crossed into the continent from Siberia via this exact route sometime between roughly 15,000 and 20,000 years ago. Chatters was careful to frame the finding precisely, noting the study established a shared common heritage between Naya and modern Native Americans, rather than a direct, provable ancestor-to-descendant relationship connecting any one specific group today back to this one specific girl. That careful, scientifically appropriate distinction still represented a genuine breakthrough, finally connecting two branches of American prehistory that had looked, on the surface, like they might not be related at all. Getting that DNA sample safely out of the cave in the first place, though, turned into its own multi-year technical challenge. Why the bones had to come out of the cave? For the first several years after the 2014 DNA study made international headlines, researchers had studied Naya's remains almost entirely in place, sending trained divers down to examine, measure, and photograph the bones directly on the chamber floor, rather than removing them. That arrangement started to break down once word of the discovery spread more widely within the recreational diving community. According to researchers involved in the project, careless or unauthorized divers began tampering with the remains after news coverage made the site's general location and significance public knowledge, disturbing bones that had sat completely undisturbed for roughly 13,000 years. To prevent any further interference and protect the scientific integrity of the site, researchers made the decision to carefully remove the accessible bones from the cave entirely, carrying out that extraction work across two separate expeditions in 2014 and 2016 under official permits issued by Mexico's Consejo de Arqueología. That removal process, conducted in 2 stages, reflected the same painstaking caution defining every other part of this project, since pulling bones that were 13,000 years old out of a flooded cave meant balancing real urgency to protect the site against the genuine risk of damaging fragile remains during the extraction itself. By the time both recovery expeditions were complete, researchers had brought up 98 separate bone elements and 30 teeth, including a complete skull, both complete arm bones, a complete left leg, most of her ribs and vertebrae, and many of the small bones from both of her hands. That total amounted to roughly half of her full original skeleton, still making her one of the most complete Paleo-American skeletons ever recovered anywhere in the New World, especially rare given that researchers also recovered an almost complete pelvis, a detail that would turn out to matter enormously once scientists finished their next round of analysis. What her bones revealed about her actual life. Once researchers had physical access to a genuinely comprehensive set of Naya's bones rather than relying only on underwater photographs, they were able to run far more detailed analysis than the original 2014 study had allowed. Results presented in March 2017 at the meeting of the Society for American Archaeology in Vancouver, and published shortly afterward, painted a considerably more difficult picture of Naya's actual daily life than a simple story of an unlucky accidental fall. Chatters explained that Naya's bones and teeth showed clear physical evidence of severe, repeated episodes of nutritional stress throughout her short life, marks left behind on hard tissue specifically because the body pulls resources away from bone and enamel growth during periods of serious food shortage. Her leg muscles showed clear signs of significant development, consistent with a life spent walking long distances across wide areas, while her arms showed comparatively weaker muscle development, notably lacking the kind of strong upper body muscle typically associated with grinding seeds, working animal hides, or carrying heavy loads for long periods. Perhaps the most striking finding from this later analysis involved a small, pitted section of her pelvic bone, a specific physical marker researchers use to determine whether a woman has gone through pregnancy and childbirth. That evidence strongly suggested Naya had given birth at some point in the months before her death, meaning this girl, who was 15 or 16 years old, was very likely already a young mother by the time she fell into Hoyo Negro. Chatters summarized the overall picture bluntly, noting that people often assume the lives of the very first Americans were easy, when the physical evidence preserved in Naya's own skeleton tells a considerably harder story: the dangerous job of bringing her home. Recovering physical samples from Naya's remains required the same kind of specialized technical cave diving skill needed just to reach Hoyo Negro in the first place, layered on top of the extreme care any archaeological excavation demands. Early recovery efforts moved slowly and carefully. Archaeologist Pilar Luna, deputy director of Mexico's National Institute of Anthropology and History, confirmed that researchers had initially managed to remove only a single molar and a small rib fragment from the site, samples just large enough to run the critical radiocarbon dating and DNA analysis that would eventually confirm the discovery's true significance. Documentation of the site went far beyond simply photographing bones as they came out of the water. Researchers used underwater videography and photography to create initial visual records, then applied a computational technique called structure from motion photogrammetry to build detailed, high-resolution, 3D models of both the skeleton and the surrounding chamber exactly as they sat in place underwater. Once bones reached the surface, researchers scanned each specimen using specialized Artec EVA and Space Spider 3D scanners at facilities belonging to Mexico's National Institute of Anthropology and History in Mexico City, capturing detailed digital replicas of more than 200 separate specimens in individual scanning sessions lasting between 5 and 15 minutes each. That digital documentation gave researchers a permanent, endlessly reusable record, allowing continued study and virtual reconstruction without needing to keep physically handling increasingly fragile ancient bone. Throughout this entire process, researchers had to work within the same brutal physical constraints governing every single visit to the site: a mile-long tunnel swim followed by a deep vertical drop, meaning every sample, every measurement, and every photograph required trained technical divers risking real danger simply to reach the working area at all. That same physical difficulty explains why the full Hoyo Negro underwater archaeological project, formally established by Mexico's National Institute of Anthropology and History in 2010, needed to bring together an entire international team of paleontologists, archaeologists, and specialized cave diving scientists from Mexico, Canada, and the United States, rather than relying on any single research group working alone. What else the pit revealed? Naya's skeleton was never the only significant discovery waiting inside Hoyo Negro. The Hoyo Negro underwater archaeological project has continued running structured research expeditions into the pit for well over a decade since its formal creation, working through the extensive collection of Ice Age animal remains scattered across the chamber floor alongside her. In November 2019, a specialized team including researcher Dominique Risolo and a cave diving crew led by Alberto Nava, one of the original 3 divers who discovered the site back in 2007, carried out a carefully planned expedition specifically to recover the pelvis of a giant ground sloth that had rested undisturbed at the bottom of the pit since the animal's own fatal fall thousands of years earlier. The pelvis measured roughly 4 feet across and weighed an estimated 80 pounds, requiring researchers to combine expertise across paleontology, 3D modeling, and mechanical engineering just to design a safe way to bring something that large and fragile back up through the same demanding dive route researchers had been navigating for years. That kind of ongoing, carefully coordinated fieldwork illustrates just how much scientific work still remains at this single site, even years after Naya's own discovery first made international headlines. Every additional fossil recovered adds another piece to researchers' broader understanding of exactly what this pit trapped over the centuries, and exactly what conditions life looked like across the Yucatan Peninsula at the very end of the last ice age. What scientists still don't fully know, even with the DNA connection to modern Native Americans now firmly established, and even with a far more detailed picture of Naya's difficult daily life now confirmed through direct bone analysis, researchers studying her remains have continued raising further open questions. The excavation recovered no cultural artifacts of any kind directly associated with Naya's body, no tools, no jewelry, no deliberately placed objects, a detail that supports researchers' interpretation that she ended up in the pit through an accidental fall rather than any kind of intentional burial or ceremony, but which also means her remains alone cannot answer every question researchers might want to ask about the broader culture and beliefs of the community she came from. Researchers also still cannot fully explain every detail of why her specific physical features looked so different from modern Native American skull shapes despite the clear underlying genetic connection her DNA revealed. Current scientific thinking suggests these physical differences likely developed gradually over thousands of years of separate evolution and adaptation happening independently on both sides of the original migration split, rather than pointing to any kind of separate, unrelated group of early settlers entirely, but pinning down the exact evolutionary timeline and specific causes behind that physical shift remains an active area of ongoing research. That combination, a settled genetic answer paired with still unresolved questions about appearance, culture, and daily life, reflects exactly the kind of honest, incremental progress real archaeological science actually produces. A single skeleton, however remarkable, rarely closes every question a discovery like this raises. It tends to answer one specific question clearly while opening up several new ones researchers will keep working through for years to come. And the research team itself has stated plainly that they intend to keep searching the pit's deeper crevices and dark corners for any additional bone elements still waiting to be found. Verdict. Here is where things actually stand. In 2007, cave divers Alejandro Alvarez, Alberto Nava, and Franco Attolini discovered a massive underwater pit called Hoyo Negro deep inside Mexico's Sac-Actun cave system, finding it scattered with the remains of extinct Ice Age animals, including saber-toothed cats, giant ground sloths, and gomphotheres, along with a remarkably complete human skeleton resting on a ledge among the bones. Researchers eventually named her Naya and confirmed, through multiple independent dating methods including radiocarbon testing, uranium-thorium dating, and detailed regional sea level analysis, that she died roughly 12,000 to 13,000 years ago, making her among the 3 oldest confirmed human skeletons ever found anywhere in the Americas. Forensic anthropologist James Chatters, previously known for his controversial work on the Kennewick man skeleton, led the team that eventually extracted usable mitochondrial DNA directly from one of Naya's molars, published in the journal Science in May 2014, proving for the first time that Paleo-Americans bearing unusual, older skull shapes and modern Native Americans actually share the same common ancestry tracing back to the ancient Beringia land bridge. After unauthorized divers began disturbing the site, researchers carefully removed roughly half her skeleton across careful expeditions in 2014 and 2016, and a 2017 follow-up study of those recovered bones revealed she likely suffered repeated bouts of malnutrition and had given birth months before her death. Naya's remains never sat sealed away by any mystery or intention. They sat undisturbed simply because a 15 or 16-year-old girl, already a young mother, fell to her death in a dry cave thousands of years before rising Ice Age seas flooded the passage completely, protecting her bones from scavengers and decay until 3 recreational cave divers, chasing nothing more than their own mapping project, happened to swim into exactly the right pitch-black chamber at exactly the right moment to finally bring her story back into the light. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.